Welcome back, Daisy Cakes! Today we're going to talk about John Brunner and Stand on Zanzibar, his 1968 Nebula-nominated novel, which also won the Hugo in 1969, because I am Daisy Ex Machina, the drag queen detective who investigates all things speculative in science fiction, fantasy, and horror. I picked Stand on Zanzibar from the 1968 Nebula nominees as part of my series where I look back on Hugo and Nebula nominated books to find an author or book I have not read before. And I feel super guilty because I know many of you love this book, but spoiler alert, I DNF'd Stand on Zanzibar. I'll let you know why I DNF'd it, but first, who was John Brunner? John Brunner was a British science fiction author born in 1934 and died in 1995 at the age of 60 at Worldcon, the science fiction convention where the Hugos are awarded. He served as an officer in the RAF, the Royal Air Force, from 1953 to 1955. In 1958, he married Marjorie Sauer, who handled his relationship with publishers until her death in 1986, and we'll get back to that. His first novel was published when he was 17 years old as a pulp paperback under the pseudonym Gil Hunt, which was a house name of Curtis Books, which published British pulp paperbacks. A house name means the name that the publisher uses as a pseudonym for maybe a stable of authors. It wasn't until after the RAF that Brunner really began pumping out novels during the late 50s and early 60s, mostly ace doubles, those now very rare and hard to find dime store novels, which were twofers, two novels in one. You flipped the book over to get the second novel. These were very pulpy space opera type stories, but then Brunner shifted. I found a very brief interview he did for BBC Two in 1979. I've cleaned up the audio because it wasn't in great shape.
Well, I served my time as a writer of hard science fiction. I wrote space opera and the Grand Manner, Interstellar Empires, that kind of thing. But I found in the long run that I had neither the educational equipment, the grounding, nor the actual temperament which this calls for. I never had a science lesson in my life, and just being dazzled with the potential of technology isn't enough to sustain a writer's career. Little by little, I found that my temperament, above all, was drawing me towards what I think of as close focus science fiction. That's to say, fiction set in that period of the future that I might reasonably expect to survive into myself. And this, paradoxically, is a great deal more challenging than the stuff I was doing earlier, because if you go way out into the voids between the galaxies, there's almost literally no restriction on what you can do with your imagination. On the other hand, if you're actually trying to extrapolate contemporary trends, then you have to impose on yourself a very firm discipline. You have to make all your projections abide by the trends and tendencies you can see in the contemporary world. And this, to me, has turned out to be much more rewarding than the wild and woolly fantasies of my early years.
Trends during this time were societal trends in overpopulation, which was a huge theme for Brunner, race relations, and these extrapolations led him to predict a lot of things, including genetic engineering, same-sex marriage, Wikipedia, and even Viagra. John Brunner was a very prolific writer, not only writing over 50 science fiction novels, but also spy thrillers, poetry, nonfiction, and even pornography, under a pseudonym, of course. His popularity began waning in the 80s, and his health declined. He tried going back to his space opera roots, but then, when his wife Marjorie died in 1986, he had a hard time because apparently Marjorie, if you remember, handled his relations with publishers because, again, apparently, Brunner was difficult to deal with. After Marjorie's death, When most of his books fell out of print, he accused publishers of a conspiracy against him. And he also fell ill during this time, so his productivity wasn't what it once was. But let's get back to his heyday during the 1960s. This was the start of the science fiction new wave movement, where authors started getting very experimental and literary and wild. Yes, science fiction writers gone wild. I ran across Brunner before when looking at the 1966 Hugo nominees for his novel, The Squares of the City, which was structured after a famous 1892 chess tournament. Then, when we get to the 1968 Nebula nominees, I found out Stand on Zanzibar was about all-powerful corporations and godlike computers. And I was thinking, boy, that sounds familiar, or at least relevant for today, especially with corporate power and AI being so forefront in the news. So I found this really interesting copy on Pango Books. By the way, if you ever are looking for used books online, check out Pango Books. This cover is the 1974 version, but it apparently uses the same artwork from the original 1968 edition. And it's really interesting with these little vignettes of different cultures throughout the world. It's apparently the second longest science fiction novel at this time, the longest, of course, being Dune by Frank Herbert. The New Wave movement was all about experimentation and breaking conventions, and you can tell that right off in John Brunner's Stand on Zanzibar just by the table of contents. I've never seen this done before, but the chapters are organized by chapter type. So the chapters aren't listed linearly. Like context are brief media or computer excerpts, and the table of contents lists under context all the chapters that are like that. And then there's categories called The Happening World, Tracking with Close-Ups, which is most of the story chapters, and so on. Anyway, I was really excited to get into Stand on Zanzibar, and I got this far, a little over 100 pages, and I just wasn't enjoying it. I ended up DNFing it. But it's not because I think it's a bad novel. I think it's brilliant. I totally get why it was nominated for the Nebula and won the Hugo in 1969. Honestly, I think if I read this 30 years ago, I would have loved it and been blown away by all the experimental things he did and the raw literary talent. But here's the thing. I was really having trouble on how it was dealing with racism. Remember, Stand on Zanzibar was written in the 1960s, and like a lot of science fiction, there is social commentary on issues of the time. So even though I'm sure this was groundbreaking for the time, as one of the main characters was a Black executive, he dealt with racism issues that were pertinent for the 1960s, which really felt kind of yucky for me here reading it in 2026. And I admit this was totally a me thing. If you go into this looking at it from a historical point of view of what progressive views on race looked like in the 1960s, I think this would be a fascinating read. And I think it's well written. I think maybe if I was just in a different headspace, I might have enjoyed it, but that wasn't the case. The other thing I wasn't totally fond of was the overpopulation issue, which was a huge deal in the 60s and 70s. Back then, if you extrapolated forward the population growth figures, we were definitely headed for a crisis. But if you aren't aware, we are now experiencing population contraction in the developed nations. Just look at Japan. So reading about overpopulation doesn't have the impact on me now that it would have back then. Also, some of the world building I just didn't buy. Like top-level executives at large corporations have to have roommates. I'm sorry, but the rich and powerful, I think, would have carved out exceptions for themselves. And I'm not hugely interested in eugenics, but that was another big theme or subplot in Stand on Zanzibar. So there you have it. I DNF'd this brilliant work of classic science fiction, and I know several of you have said how much you'll love this book, and I get why. It's an incredible book. I think in another time and place, I would have loved it too, but right now, I had to pass. And I feel so guilty. I'm sorry I wasn't able to get through it. But what about you? Have you read or do you want to read Stand on Zanzibar by John Brunner? Let me know down in the comments. And while you're there, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel. Keep a lookout for next time when I choose a book from the nominees of the 1969 Nebula Awards. Until we meet again, may all the books you read be blessed.